Well, hello, I am Stephen Roach Knight, and I am excited to be here talking with Diana Butler Bass. For those of you who are not already familiar, Diana is the author of a number of best-selling books, including her latest, entitled Freeing Jesus, Rediscovering Jesus as Friend, Teacher, Savior, Lord, Way, and Presence, as well as Grateful, the Subversive Practice of Giving Thanks, and Grounded, Finding God in the World, A Spiritual Revolution, and many, many other fantastic books that you should go check out. And she's also the author of a Substack newsletter entitled From the Cottage, which I highly recommend you subscribe to, where she recently wrote Not Dead Yet in response to the latest Pew and public religion research on the surprising surge in white mainline Protestants suddenly overtaking white evangelicals in terms of raw numbers, based on how those organizations define those terms, both mainline and evangelical. So definitely go subscribe to Diana's newsletter at Substack. And let me just start, before we jump into this conversation, by reading this little excerpt from your piece, Diana, on this research. You write, Christianity in, or perhaps the Christianities of, America involves a host of complex concerns about generational shifts, political issues, cultural tastes, and most of all, the ever-present spiritual wandering of a people shaped by religious experience and a nomadic soul. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and take a deep dive into this latest data and perhaps peer into the crystal ball with me a little bit to see maybe what the future might hold next for the mainline church and for white evangelicalism, which we both come out of, right?
That's right. I'm really glad to be talking to you about this. It's a fascinating topic, and this is actually a fairly big news story. And it has been getting the attention of people who have a bit of a nose for news that comes from unexpected edges. So this is important stuff. Yeah.
It's like looking at that chart, and I'll try to put the chart in here in the video. You point out in your piece, and you look at the progression there. It was really 2016 that was the low point for mainline Protestantism in terms of the numbers, and it was from that point on that it began to tick up, and white evangelicalism was sort of steadily kind of going down. So it doesn't seem that it's a coincidence that coincides with the election of Donald Trump.
It doesn't to me either. And I think the numbers are interesting for a couple of different reasons. One, the evangelical number in the 21st century was the highest at the very beginning of the century. And so this same PRRI chart that showed the increase in numbers of white mainline Protestants also shows that in 2006, the percentage of the population who were white evangelicals was around 23%. And that's a big number. It's been a fairly big number, about a quarter to a third of the population for several decades. So, when we came into the 21st century, it looked kind of typical. And I think that right around that time, white mainliners were probably about 18, maybe 17% of the population. I don't have that number quite as clearly in my mind as I do that evangelical number. And so what happened through the first 20 years, first 15 or 20 years of this century, is that the evangelical number started to drop. And the white mainline number sort of continued to drop. That number had been dropping for a long time. And so it stabilized occasionally. It would drop a little bit more. It would stabilize again. It would drop a little bit more. So by the time we get to 2016, we've got 12.8% of the population are white mainline Protestants, which is the lowest number I ever saw in any of the kind of data keeping around white mainline Protestantism. And frankly, I was really sad about that because I had thought for several years that the number would rise. And I had lots of good reasons for thinking it would rise, but it didn't. It kept going down. And yet at the same time, the evangelical number was also going down, just not as fast. And sometimes it would stabilize as too. And once in a while would have a little uptick. But now in the last 4 years, the evangelical number just sort of continued to go down, and not just go down, but it's going down very fast now. And the mainline number started to go up. And so it's sort of what I had expected, but I had expected it maybe 5 years before it did. Yet here we are. Some percentage of people do seem to be who have left white evangelicalism. So we're talking here about white people who still want to be Protestants, but they no longer want to be called evangelicals. And so some percentage of them, of course, went into the none of the above religiously unaffiliated category, which has, interestingly enough, stabilized around 23% of the population. And it appears that some percentage of them have now decided to go toward white mainline churches. Yeah. And that's big news. It's big news for those denominations. And it's also that precipitous. I mean, that is a precipitous drop of people in the United States, white people in the United States, who no longer want to be identified as evangelicals. I mean, it's huge in a fairly short period of time.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that third category. There are other categories, Catholic, etc., but that unaffiliated category is the other big one, that we've been tracking there, and that's been getting a lot of attention from the media because it has been steadily climbing. And like you said, that's another interesting piece of this latest data, that number has stabilized. It's not, and again, it's just in this last year that it's sort of kind of leveled off in 2020. So it remains to be seen how, whether that will trend out, continue to go that way. But it is interesting that it sort of coincides with, like you said, it appears that folks, and just to help folks understand, when from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're talking about the way that Pew and PRRI sort of define these terms. It's sort of, if they identify, they say, I go to a Methodist church, I go to a Presbyterian church, Disciples of Christ, one of these quote unquote mainline denominations, one of these historically mainline denominations, if they answered that question and identify with one of those churches, then they go into that mainline category, right?
Well, some places do it that way. I'm pretty sure Pew does it that way. PRRI has a different one, okay. But it's interesting the way they do it too. And this kind of stuff is hard to capture. PRRI's assignment of categories, whether you're evangelical or not, is around a question not of church membership, but of how you answer the question: do you consider yourself evangelical, or have you been born again? And so, those markers are pretty clear, and that's that insider language, and people who are part of those churches know exactly what's being asked of them when they're talking to a survey taker. And so that's how PRI has pulled out the percentage of the population who are evangelicals. And then there's also, so then the sort of the next question is, if a person says, no, I'm not, then PRI goes, are you Protestant or Catholic? And if the person says they're Catholic, of course, they go into the white Catholic category.
Yep.
But if they say they're Protestants, then they go into this other category of
Gotcha.
of white mainline. And so for PRI, it's a little bit of a catch-all category, and people have criticized them for that. But it's also a category that they've been tracking now for, more than a decade. So it's a category question that has remained the same. And it's about how people think about their religious identity, not necessarily what churches they go to, or even whether or not they are showing up. So there is, a little bit of a question that is left, I think, for other surveys and researchers to ask of those people. Are you going to church? How often do you go to church? Where do you go to church? And so there are a couple of different possibilities that go in that category.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because it says to me, this isn't necessarily, and you say this in your piece, this isn't a moment for triumphalism for mainline denominations. It's really a question of, like you said, self-reflection and opportunity, right? Because these are folks who are saying, I can no longer identify as evangelical, but I'm still Christian, I'm still Protestant. Where do I belong? Do I fit in somewhere else? And mainline denominations have an opportunity to speak to those folks and reach out to those folks and say, here we are, you're welcome, come on in. Speak to that.
I do think it's really interesting, because at the outset of this century, as we began to see that evangelical number collapse, first of all, people didn't believe it. People literally kept saying that things were wrong with every survey that showed the percentage of white evangelicals declining. I literally felt like the proverbial voice crying in the wilderness every time I talked about this. I would have people stand up at events and tell me that I was just wrong. And while I had charts and numbers and all kinds of things on slides behind me. And so it's fascinating that people now are saying, oh, I guess this is true. And so then that's sort of the next assumption was that folks who were leaving, white people who were leaving evangelicalism, were going to the none of the above category. And I do think that was actually the first way station. Because people didn't know where to go. I have so many, you and I both, we have so many friends who grew up in like the Assemblies of God or the Southern Baptist Convention or at some evangelical megachurch. And once they sort of said, hey, I'm not that anymore, they grew up in these very isolated worlds where for their whole lives, however old they were, 20, 25, 30 years old, they were literally told that like Lutherans and Methodists and Episcopalians and liberal Congregationalists, that all those people were the devil, and that they weren't even Christians. And so there's very little possibility in the minds of some people who are ex-evangelicals that they're ever going to sort of find any kind of other religious community, because these communities either didn't exist or they were just so damned by everything they'd heard for a lifetime that it was hard to imagine walking into the door of your local Lutheran church if you had been taught that that was a place of heresy. So I think what we're seeing now is that some portion of those evangelicals who initially popped into the none of the above category are sort of saying that they want to hold on to religious identity. And that's a change, and it does do what you're suggesting, and it also is something that I'm suggesting, is it doesn't mean that these denominations are having all of a sudden a big revival and that that 20 somethings are all of a sudden showing up, in your local Presbyterian church. But it does mean that there are a group of people out there who are hungry to find a home. And they certainly know that home is no longer in evangelicalism, They have not been happy with the option of floating into the unaffiliated category, or they were there and they're wanting to leave now. But so they still have some fondness, for doctrine and theology and the life of the church. And so what's going to happen is that the churches are going to have to figure out how to connect with that population of people. And there will be some of those folks, and we also know some of these people. Some of those people have found their ways into churches, and there are some mainline congregations that have been very good about welcoming people who are ex-evangelicals. But there are a lot of congregations still that just literally have no idea what to do when some of these folks show up at their doors.
You write in your piece, you describe white evangelicals who may be moving on to mainline churches this way. They're often sad, angry, and wounded, and perhaps tentative about participating in new churches. They're used to particular styles of worship, lay involvement, and church offerings, simple things like decent parking lots and babysitting for kids, and may find even the most welcoming and inclusive mainline church lacking in such things. So that's a little bit of a piece of advice there for mainline churches that, are trying to understand and figure out how can we be welcoming these folks. You've been Episcopalian now for a number of years. I ended up in the Disciples of Christ denomination. There are denominations and there are churches, but not every church and not in every mainline denomination is quote unquote progressive or, even thinking about trying to be welcoming, in this way. My biggest concern, and you addressed this a little bit, is I've experienced this some in my journey from evangelicalism into the mainline, of just sort of this, I guess, arrogance maybe, but just sort of this almost like apathy or indifference of just like, oh, great, well, welcome to the party. We've been here doing this. Glad you could join us. We're not going to get too excited about you, white evangelicals, finally coming knocking on our door. And that's again, that's not everybody in the mainline, but I've experienced it from some folks, and perhaps you did as well. That's certainly out there, and I just want to say to my friends in the mainline, like, this is a huge opportunity. This is a moment to be seized and not shrugged at, I guess.
Yeah, my sense is don't blow it. I literally, I can relate so much to what you're saying. I'm doing another project right now. I'm just starting it. It's on the history of the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the 1920s. So I'm just kind of rereading a lot of that kind of the argument of the 1920s. And I've been thinking about what happened to American Protestantism extending outward from the Scopes monkey trial and a lot of splits in denominations, all these different things. And one of the things that the more conservative Christians have yelled about for the last 100 years is that liberal Christians are like that. And I have been referring to it recently, not a lot publicly, but I think you probably heard me talk about this at Wild Goose at one point. I've referred to liberal Protestantism as a culture of hubris. And, it's like, oh, yeah, well, there's evolution and we were right about XYZ. And, we were the ones who marched with Martin Luther King. And so, yeah, we've been here. We've been doing this stuff. Too bad everybody's been ignoring us, but we've been right all along. And so if someone comes in the door, there's this sort of attitude of intellectual and even cultural superiority. Oh, we're the most college educated, or and they are. Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Episcopalians are the most well-educated Protestant groups, and they're also the wealthiest Protestant groups. And so there's this level of, superiority that kind of is a stench in some of these communities, and certainly in the denominational institutions that this kind of is present. Yeah. It's not for everybody, not everywhere, not every congregation has it, but it's just enough that it's really noticeable. And it's a turnoff. And I was recently reading an article in First Things, which is like one of the most unlikely places you can ever imagine me reading an article from, probably, Steve. And it was literally an article written by a guy who is a conservative Presbyterian who lives in Tennessee, who I find myself in odd agreement with on several different issues. But one of the things that he was writing about in that article was what he called mainline Protestant hubris. And I looked at it and I thought, well, there it is. There's two people in America using this terminology to describe mainline Protestantism, me and a conservative PCA guy from West Tennessee. So that's weird, if you think about it, and I often get in trouble with my own people for, being too honest about certain things and not being willing to sugarcoat the problems we have, while at the same time being a huge cheerleader for these churches, because I think that there's so much that's good about them that I hate seeing these kinds of glaring flaws be overlooked. And the glaring flaws are often the things that are the very things that are the biggest stumbling blocks to new people coming into their churches. So
I want to quote you back to yourself one more time, but it's sort of like hashtag not all mainliners. Like,
right.
we get it, not all mainline, but we have to talk about and be honest about the reality that this does exist. And if people bump into that and experience that, that's going to be a bad experience for them. And so it needs to be addressed in some way, at some level. Well, let me quote you again, because I appreciate so much of what you said in your piece. It says, you write, "This is a moment to listen well to those who may be coming your way. This shift is occurring in large part because white evangelical churches have failed, not necessarily because mainline churches are doing everything right. Hubris is not the right response to the data, but self-reflection is." What do you recommend? How can mainline denominations, mainline churches individually do this? What kind of resources and tools are out there that you would point people to? I think I might have a few ideas myself, but I'm curious to hear what you think, Diana, about where mainline churches should be looking right now to do that work.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure that I have as probably good of resource list as you might have for that. One of the things that I am concerned about is there needs to be sort of a practice of mutual listening, because some of the people who are coming into the mainline, and I actually see this quite a bit on social media, there is right now in some quarters of the mainline, because there's such a level of desperation actually to have younger clergy, because younger clergy bring down the price of health insurance plans. And so for a very long time, like I said, money is a big deal. But for a very long time, mainline clergy was often older. And that meant that mainline clergy was a very expensive proposition for a local congregation, because pension contributions and also health insurance are going to be a lot higher for those groups. And so there's been a real press by church pension funds and church insurance funds to bring in younger clergy. And a lot of the younger clergy were evangelicals. I mean, it's really interesting to see, sort of watching across the social media field to see how many people who are now clergy in these denominations didn't grow up in them. Mm-hmm. And instead were, they talk about how they used to be Southern Baptist or Catholic. They come from one of those two places. And so on one hand, there's a kind of a desperate denominational need for people who are young bodies to fill these positions. And there's not enough attentiveness toward formation of some of these people within the tradition. I literally follow accounts on social media where there are people who got ordained this year who have been part of their denominations for less than 5 years. And that's nice in the sense that they're bringing a lot of enthusiasm as converts, but it's less good in the sense that they don't have a really deep sort of lived experience of the practices and sort of the ethos of these denominations. And even though, these denominations have hubris, they also have a lot of stuff that's really interesting and really good and quite beautiful, but you don't kind of know it until you've lived it for a little while.
Yeah.
So when these denominations encounter these converts with this enthusiasm to become clergy, that's fantastic. But they also have to figure out, how do you mentor enthusiastic young converts into what is the best of your tradition?
Right.
Not just every lousy custom that a local church has, to think about that really seriously, and to really create a network of support and mentoring and maturing converts who want to be leaders in denominations. History needs to be taught well. I mean, there's so much to do, and it would really give retiring and older clergy actually a lot of meaning to their retirement if they were put in relationship with these younger, I think, converts. So that's the work that denominations need to do to help the converts.
Yeah.
But then the opposite is true as well, is the converts do come in and the first thing they see is bad nurseries and no parking lots, and really dull music oftentimes, and all kinds of other things. The church's evangelism program sucks. It's like, and so the young convert starts talking about this stuff, and the first thing the people in the church do say, oh, well, we can't do that because that's what the Baptists do or what have you. And so then there's no listening on the part of the church to what the young converts bring.
Yeah.
And so I'm really concerned about both sides of that equation, is that the young converts come in without really knowing what they're encountering fully because there's been a lack of attentiveness about the kind of really creative mentoring that could be happening. And on the other hand, the young converts come in and they start, coming up with all these great ideas. And then they feel like they're not being listened to because, of course, the churches, whenever somebody suggests change like that, people in churches kind of go, they freak. Not every church, but many churches, that's the case. And it feels like a criticism. And so they then begin sort of just kind of pressing those people's opinions towards the edges. And then those people begin to build in cynicism and self-doubt and like, well, why did I ever join this church if nobody wanted to listen to what I was bringing? And so this for me is a moment that is fraught with potential misunderstanding, which I actually do see happening on social media primarily, and also in some of the institutions, like some of the seminaries. But it also does open up these amazing possibilities for structuring some new ways of learning throughout the communities. And so I kind of see it as a both and moment. And I'm I have days where I'm more worried than optimistic, and then occasionally I have days that I'm more optimistic than worried. But I lean more, I'm sorry to say this, a little bit more towards the worry part at the moment.
I understand. I hear that. And just to sort of add on a little bit to what you were just saying, I think, and and I think you did say this a little bit, but I just want to underscore, not just for the folks coming out of evangelicalism who want to go into ministry in mainline churches, but for people in general coming into those mainline churches to go through some kind of membership class where they get taught a little bit of the history of this denomination, but in a really good way, in a way that sort of owns the histories, says, here's the things we've done good, here's where we haven't done so well, here's what we're working on, like an honest telling of the history, but that uplifts, like, this is the tradition, this is why we are Presbyterian or Episcopalian or whatever, so that the people who haven't grown up in those churches really get learn what it is that they're becoming a part of in a way that helps them.
One of the things I think that is most intriguing to me, and I think is most interesting in relationship to the work that you do as well, with racial justice, and also the work we do mutually on LGBT rights and Q rights and women's rights, is that the mainlines, they've fought about those things for a long time. And when they got to the point where they were ordaining women and really working hard, I think, on issues around feminism in terms of liturgy and worship and inclusion across the denominational structures, et cetera, or when they got to the point of ordaining gay people, and certainly in issues around racial reconciliation and just trying to understand white supremacy. The reason the mainline churches got there is because they had certain kinds of theological approaches to the Bible. And so it is historically, the growth of those social justice movements within mainline Protestantism came from liberal biblical studies, historical criticism, and liberal theology, as well as out of a capacity to question tradition and to, when it was appropriate, buck authorities that were saying no, figuring out ways of working around hierarchical structures that said you couldn't do these things. And so none of that stuff in these denominations would have happened without any of that. And what is happening now, and this is one of the things that has me really sort of vaguely terrified, is that some percentage, and I have no studies on this, I just can see it. So that means there's enough of it that can actually be viewed by a person who wasn't doing numbers work. This is anecdotal pileup, is what I call it, sort of as a historian. Is that there a number of the people who are coming in now as clergy from either Catholicism or conservative Protestantism don't know that history. And they just think that these denominations have, I mean, they seem to appear to think that these denominations have accepted women, gay people, and people of color since the beginning of time. And they legitimately believe that you can have what they understand to be traditional orthodoxy along with these social justice views. Now, maybe you can, but that's not how those denominations got there.
Right.
Those denominations did not sit around saying, we accept the Apostles' Creed, therefore we're going to ordain gay people. In those denominations, creedal orthodoxy and conservative biblical interpretation were seen as a gate, a wall against social justice.
Yeah.
And so certain elements of the tradition had to be questioned and even dismantled before those social justice issues could be fairly addressed.
Yeah.
And that's what some of the new clergy don't understand.
Right.
And that is a problem for these denominations. Because that means that their actual capacity to question tradition in light of a wider vision of the common good is slowly being eroded by people who still have fairly hierarchical and even conventional ideas about theology and the Bible.
Right, right. And I'll just say from my own experience and my own denomination, I think mainline denominations have gone after sort of whoever we can get to sort of come in and I'll just be blunt. Here, we'll give you money to start a church in our denomination so that we can say that we've started 1,000 new churches in the last however many years or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. And so...
And that's where the desperation of low numbers will get you. And the interesting thing, of course, is now that we're seeing the low numbers in white evangelicalism, we're going to see how desperate they are.
True.
Which is, I think, something we are seeing with the support of MAGA and QAnon. Because right now, as white evangelical numbers sink, there are white evangelical ministers who are kind of borderline about these things, who actually do question them privately, but can't do that publicly because it would cause their churches to split, or they'd lose members of their congregations, or they'd be run out of town on a rail. And so that there are acts of desperation kind of on both sides in order to keep the numbers up. But right now we're talking about the good news story for the white mainline, and that is people. That is, the simplest part of this story is the word evangelical among white people is toxic, and the word mainline among white people is warm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that kind of how the terms are colored, emotional color, makes a difference to the future of those two communities. It means that people are going to continue, I think the trend is set for a few years at least, for the toxicity and the on fire, getting my name out of this group kind of thing with white evangelicals.
Yeah.
And the possibility of a warmth developing around the terms liberal Protestant, mainline Protestant, what have you. That could increase, and that will mean good things for the mainline.
Yeah. Yeah. I am curious to talk about the emergent church movement with you in this conversation, something that we both were very much involved with. You allude to it in your piece, but just sort of asking the question or saying this is part of the conversation. I look at this and I just think because of the timing of things, it doesn't seem like there was much role of the emergent church movement in what we're seeing right now. As much as I would like to think that there was, but what do you think, Diana? There's so many people who just don't have any clue what the emergent church movement was. I would say it was sort of like the mid 90s through maybe 2010, 2012, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think so.
And it was a lot of folks coming out of white evangelicalism, doing new things with church. And a lot of us ended up in mainline denominations. And it seems like there's a lot of folks out there in the ex-evangelical movement who are either just getting rid of religion and affiliation altogether, or there are a lot, that we are seeing that this number who say, I'm still a Christian, but I can't be evangelical anymore. Right. But there doesn't seem to be a coalescing yet of a movement of those folks that is pro-church in the way that the emergent church movement was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that, the question about emergent church, which does come up quite frequently, and we did talk about this, a couple of years ago at Wild Goose with Mike Clausen and me and I guess Brian McLaren. And although I wrongly called Mike Clausen Trip Fuller in in a tweet about this very thing. I'm so sorry, Mike. What I think that there's a certain misunderstanding historically of what a movement is. I think that emergent church kind of imagined itself that it would be the kind of movement that would eventually become like Wesleyanism, a big movement with a lot of people in it that would have a historically recognized name and real institutional impact over time. And there are movements like that. The Franciscans started out as a religious movement and they end up as being a religious order in the Roman Catholic Church. So we have great historical examples of that. But there are plenty of other things, kind of movements in church history that oftentimes didn't even really have names. They were just sort of groups of friends who did stuff together, saw the world a very similar way, wrote about it, maybe preached in churches in neighboring areas, and had an impact on the circles that they were part of. And in that sense, movements can be like that. Movements can be like small garden plots, as it were, that seeds spread, and then you can't discernibly find the first garden plot anymore. So I think that emergent wound up being more like that. I think that emergent really wound up being what it originally claimed to be, and that was a network of friends who had a similar vision about future of the church. And if that was your original idea of a movement, you can say that emergent succeeded because most of those people are still friends. It doesn't mean that we're all necessarily, best bosom buddies with each other, but
right.
People in those movements, we've stayed kind of moving in similar directions. We care about one another. We've seen each other grow. We've developed voices in the public square. We still write our books. We're part of mainline churches. So I think that emergent church is more like seed on the wind as a movement, which is the way so many movements are in religion.
Yeah. I think I remember hearing you sort of compare emergent to maybe like the transcendentalists at one point, or
I did a couple times.
Yeah. And you're making me think of what, the social gospel movement. We talk about that never sort of, I mean, you see its influence in a lot of places, but it's not, like you said, it's not its own thing that,
and transcendentalism is a great example because it never coalesced into a church. And how do you track the movement of transcendentalism? Well, every mainline school kid still reads Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on self-reliance or Thoreau on pacifism.
Yeah.
Or how many women, oh my gosh, how many women in the history of American history have read Little Women? I mean, Little Women is the ultimate novel, a transcendental novel. And every generation of women just read that book and read that book and read that book over and over again. And the ideas of American transcendentalism just get in the brains of little American girls through that novel. And so in a very real sense, I think that that's the way emergent is. It's going to, years from now, what will be left is sort of a memory that all these people were friends, and some essays somewhere, it's hard to predict which ones, will still stand out, and they'll wind up inside of seminary curriculums. And there will be a book or two that's very unexpected that people will still say, oh yeah, this is kind of like the Bible of, and we'll know that that these ideas did influence this moment in the early 21st century.
Yeah. And I guess we have an evangelical movement right now that has a lot of different voices in it. And, I guess the thing, just speaking for myself, that's sad to me is there are voices within the evangelical movement that are, I'll say, not anti-church. I don't know if I can go so far as to say pro-church, but they're
Right.
not anti-church. Some voices are strongly agnostic. I remember having an exchange with Chrissy Stroop on their on Twitter, just saying, like, I get it, you're agnostic and atheist or whatever now, but a lot of evangelicals aren't throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Like, could you provide, like, there are all these resources, there are all these books that have been written on how to deconstruct your theology about X, Y, or Z. Like the work has already been done on a lot of these things. Could you just make these resources available? And their response was sort of like, well, I have a resources page on my website, go check it out. And like, none of these things were there. And it just sort of came down to, the emergent thing was just this thing that happened. It's not really relevant to us. We're finding our own way and figuring this out. And I get it. Every generation sort of has to do that. And at the same time, I just sort of want to scream, like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, you don't, like, there's help for you if you want to, not be evangelical, but you still want to be Christian and figure out what you believe about homosexuality, figure out what all of these different things, atonement theory, many things have been written. So, and I'm not part of that community because I've ended up in the mainline and I'm here now. So maybe there's good things happening within that movement right now that we will see and we will hear about. But it just, I guess my heart goes out to say, I wish, I wish this was happening, or there was something more visible, maybe.
I think Chrissy's great, and we've had occasional quarrels too. and yet those are quarrels out of a similarity, because I think with most of the ex-evangelical community, a person like myself, it's just like, I get it. I just think that that's an example of how this is going to have to move in the future. It's like what we share with someone like Chrissy and other ex-evangelicals is this real passion for racial justice, a real passion for inclusion of gay, lesbian, transgender people. I mean, we're on board, but we're going to we understand those passions vis-a-vis certain kinds of spiritual and theological issues differently, and that is okay. And that's what we're going to have to learn to be with in the 21st century. And I'm cool with that, frankly.
Yeah. I'm cognizant of the time, but
yes.
I wanted to close with going back to, a couple things. One, I think you're right, that you said the trend is sort of set. I mean, I think as much as this acceleration has happened in these last few years, I think in large part because of Trumpism. Trumpism is still here. Trumpism is going to be around for a while. What's happening in the Southern Baptist denomination, these things are going to continue this trend for the foreseeable future of people just, coming to the end of their ability to identify with this thing. And it'll be interesting to see, some of the folks who within white evangelicalism, I'm thinking of like an Andy Stanley or, someone like that who we've been hearing for a long time. Well, he's more progressive than he, when is he, when are some of these larger leaders within the white evangelical world going to finally make that sort of break? And I think when that happens, maybe then there'll be folks who can say, okay, I can be an Andy Stanley evangelical because, or whatever. But I still identify as evangelical, but I'm a Reverend William Barber evangelical, right?
Well, that of course is the third thing, because we're just talking about white evangelicals here.
Yeah.
There's black evangelicals.
Exactly. And then just the resources going back, and I don't know if this, when I was working with the Disciples of Christ, this was several years ago now, we had programs like one was called New Beginnings to help older churches in the denomination sort of go through a process of discernment. Should we close? Should we sort of sell the building and move somewhere else? Should
Right.
we, or should we, basically nest another congregation and sort of transition from being this older style church to a younger, more, I would say evangelical worshiping style church. All of these, all of these different options that could exist for an existing mainline church. That's just one program that. And I'm sure other mainline denominations have similar programs to this, UCC and Presbyterian and so forth. But then Chris Smith had a great little book, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but I'll put it in the comments or the description or whatever when we post this, all about the process that his church went through in Indianapolis of hosting conversations. That really as a fantastic model for any church, but I would think especially for mainline churches to both sort of get to know themselves and help other people coming in to know who they are,
Mm-hmm.
but also do that process of discernment of like, who do we want to be? What is our role in this community? What are we doing and what should we be doing? As a faith community in this neighborhood, in this area, other churches or other organizations might be doing X, Y, and Z, but nobody's doing this. And we've got people in our church who are really great at doing this. So let's just going through that process of discernment of figuring out what is our role. And helping people find their place in that. So anyway, I'll put the link to Chris's book, but those are just a couple things that came to my mind and just thinking about what tools might be there to help mainline churches that are thinking about how
Yeah, I think that's really, conversation is really key. If people are willing to have it. It can be hard. There have been a series of conversations where I live that were hosted by it was socially justice, progressive kind of Methodist church, very much kind of what I would say in the Sojourners magazine kind of tradition, that hosted a whole bunch of conversations in my neighborhood, as well as dinners between a lot of different kinds of congregations. And it was really very rewarding. And people were finally kind of seeing the breadth of faith practice in our neighborhood, which was really good. But mainliners to this point have actually been fairly insulated from that. They haven't had to talk to other people because they're insulated usually by their own languages. Mainliners get very into their own languages, and also by money. These have been very wealthy traditions that haven't had to reach out beyond their boundaries in order to do kinds of things they want. But as the money has started to dry up in recent years, I think there's been kind of more of a need to sort of see beyond the walls that have sort of kept people inside of buildings. So I mean, I think that's really interesting stuff to do. But before we finish, I just don't want to pass. I also wrote a piece about this on CNN. And I talked about what was going on with the end of white evangelicalism. And in that particular piece, I started it out with my own experience. The first draft of that piece included things that got left on the cutting room floor because you just can't spew anything, at CNN, despite what seems to be the case to the contrary. You have to have real editors and things. And one of the things my editor took out was I had talked in the original piece about the non-denominational congregations that were emerging, that were not evangelical, that were functionally mainline. but without the brand names. And this is also one of the places, of course, where emergent has shown up. There are not tons of them, but there are enough of them that I can go around and probably find one in nearly every major American city. And, so there's Grace Point in Nashville, City Church in San Francisco, the Way Collective in Santa Barbara, California. I can't remember that right now. I can't think of the name of the one that I know in LA, but they have names that sound like they might be evangelical churches. Grace Point, yeah. City Church, Way Collective, whatever, but they aren't. They're functionally mainline churches, and often they've literally taken, like, they've stolen the actual liturgies of mainline churches. Many of them use Episcopal liturgies that they modify and change to meet their communities. So the Episcopal Church, meanwhile, is going along calling God He and having huge fights about whether or not you can have inclusive liturgy, while a place like Grace Church or Grace Point or the Way Collective have simply changed the language to gender neutral, or occasionally have liturgies that call God she, but it's the Episcopal liturgy because there's no bishop they have to answer to. They just rewrite it. Mm-hmm. And so actually some of these churches are more liturgically adventurous and more progressive theologically than the mainline churches who use the same liturgies and theologies. And I mean, I love these churches. I can't say enough good things about these churches. They are so inventive. They are willing to engage issues that other churches are afraid of. And I just find so much hope in them. And sometimes, like the Way Collective in Santa Barbara, there are 2 mainline churches or 3 mainline churches that sponsor them. And so the Way Collective, which is doing all this imaginative, post-Christian, out there stuff, is sponsored by the Disciples of Christ and an Episcopal church. I think it might be the only congregation in America that's co-sponsored by the Disciples of Christ and the Episcopal church. And so these 2 very conventional, traditional, white churches are sponsoring this very alternative other kind of congregation. And what's fascinating, of course, is the Way Collective is bigger than either of the 2 host churches.
Yeah.
And so, this is stuff that's happening all over, and that is sort of off the radar screen of most people. Yeah. And yet that, to me, I mean, we have to be really careful in thinking that just because people are no longer going to Southern Baptist churches or evangelical mega churches that are very conservative, they're not just going to the approved brand name mainline church. People are sort of floating around the mainline and oftentimes taking mainline stuff, but are forming new congregations. And that is the mark of American spirituality. Is you take what you like and then you begin to play with it in a new cultural setting, and some of that stuff eventually sticks and becomes something more noticeable on the spiritual landscape.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Diana, again, for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And I look forward to continuing to have this conversation as we see how things unfold in the coming years. But great to see you. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's fun. And it's wonderful to be able to share some very interesting and even good news for more liberal Protestantism. And it's been fun to talk to you, Steve.
Awesome.